is going to kind of look at the broad overview of what you need to think about doing your first stop motion. And remember, simple doesn't always mean worse. It just depends how you set things up anyways. This is a simple setup I have with my son. Essentially what we have here, August is moving little letters across a piece of paper, and we have an iPad with an app installed up there on the shelf, and it's pointing down. We have kind of a convenience setup here to do it. We have an app on the iPad that we downloaded called Stop Motion Studio, and this is what I recommend that you do right now. It works a lot like Dragon Frame in that it captures one picture at a time onto your timeline, and then you can pause it at any time. You can see where you are kind of by scrolling backwards or forwards, and then afterwards you can review those frames. So at times I got my hand in the shot, you can delete those really easily on the app. The app is super self-explanatory, so all you have to do is go download it. You'll figure it out. My son, who's 6, figured it out.
It takes pictures, and then it puts them together, and then they go in order to make a whole movie.
Let's walk through some of the things that you need to think about as you're doing this stop motion, just general concepts. First, keep it steady. Now, essentially, you need a tripod or some sort of stable surface for your camera. Here, I had the ideal situation in that I could lay the iPad on a shelf above the paper, and we could occasionally stand up and see what was going on. You could also use a DSLR on a tripod like this. I've done that plenty of times before, or recently I purchased this holder for the iPad, and that works great. 2, don't touch your camera. It looks terrible when you touch your camera. You need to have a remote trigger, something like this, that you can trigger your camera with. For instance, this is my son not doing that and touching the picture button every time, and it moves the frame around. It just doesn't look all that fantastic. Instead, you can set it to say take a picture every 10 seconds or so. That's something you can do on the app. It'll beep a few seconds before the shot and give you a second to get out of it.
Oh, gotta get out of the frame.
Or you could download the app on, say, another phone, link the iPad and the phone together and trigger it that way. And we're actually triggering it with a remote camera. So right up there, that is one of my iPhones. And then over here, it's being triggered by this iPad. And I found that works really nicely because it gives you a remote view of what you're taking a picture of. 3, make sure you're shooting manually. Just like you do a time lapse with your DSLR, you want to make sure your aperture, your shutter, your ISO, your white balance, your focus, all of those things are locked. You're not touching them. Now in the app, you can do that. You can lock all of those things. You just have to click the button that says don't change as I'm shooting. Because if you don't do that, you risk having a flicker effect. And 4 is lighting. Now, speaking of the flicker effect, the way you avoid that is have good, consistent lighting. And that usually means you're going to be shooting inside, where light's not changing. You want to make sure there's not a window nearby. Now, the lighting doesn't have to be anything complex. Light it just like you would any other scene. Now, the one important thing to realize, though, is that you're going to cast shadows as you move around. So if you're stepping back out of each frame to take the picture, you could be causing a flicker of yourself based on where you're standing. For instance, my son was doing this unintentionally here, and also just realized sometimes that flicker is a thing. Yeah, if you go on and you find After Effects templates for stop motion, they add flicker to them to sell it. You may or may not want that flicker, but hopefully you're doing it intentionally instead of unintentionally. 5 is frame rate. Now, the only reason to think about that is you need to know how many frames to shoot to have a certain sequence in your video. So, for instance, you're watching this at 30 frames per second. So if you wanted a 10-second stop motion, that would mean 300 frames. In reality, doing stop motion, you're not going to be using that many frames per second because you're going to have this jittery kind of stop motion effect. So you're probably going to end up only shooting 7 or 10 frames per second. And you can play with this in your editing program, but just realize that's about what we're looking at. Audio. Now, this is